If you walk through the streets of central London today, you will see statues of heroes. You see Winston Churchill towering over Parliament. You see memorials to the brave pilots of the Royal Air Force. The story we are told about World War II is simple. We are taught that Britain stood alone. We are taught that the British people sacrificed everything, spending every last penny to save the world from the Nazi war machine. We are told they emerged in 1945 as noble heroes, bankrupt but victorious. But that is a lie. There is a different version of this story. It is a version you won't find in British school books. It is a version remembered with bitterness in the villages of Bengal and the streets of Delhi. In this version, Britain didn't go broke fighting the war. Instead, they found a way to make someone else pay for it. They ran up a massive credit card bill in someone else's name. This is the story of how the British Empire pulled off the greatest financial heist in history. They extracted $45 trillion from their poorest subjects to save their own economy. They rebuilt their welfare state on the backs of starving peasants. To understand this robbery, you have to look past the battlefield. You have to look into the bank vault. Back in 1939, the British Empire wasn't just a map of red territories. It was a financial trap. It was called the Sterling Area. The rules were rigged from the start. If you were a colony, like India, Malaya, or Nigeria, you were not allowed to be independent with your money. You couldn't hold gold reserves. You couldn't hold US dollars. You were forced, by law, to keep your national savings in British pounds, and those pounds had to stay in one place, the Bank of England in London. Think of it like a bank where you can deposit money, but the manager decides if you're allowed to make a withdrawal. When the Second World War started, Britain panicked. Modern war is incredibly expensive. It burns money. You need steel for tanks. You need oil for ships. You need rubber for tires. And most importantly, you need millions of tons of food to feed your armies. Britain is a small island. It didn't have these resources. It had to buy them. In the first year of the war, Britain tried to pay its way honestly. They used their gold reserves to buy weapons from the United States. But the gold ran out fast. By 1941, Britain was technically insolvent. They were broke. They couldn't pay cash for the tools of war anymore. This is where the looting began. The British government realized something simple. They couldn't force the United States to give them free supplies. The Americans wanted to be paid, but Britain could force their colonies to give it free supplies. The biggest prize was India. India wasn't just a place to recruit soldiers. It was a massive factory. It produced textiles for uniforms, steel for weapons, and food for the troops. The British government needed these Indian goods desperately to fight the war in North Africa and the Middle East. But remember, Britain was broke. They had no money to pay the Indian factory owners. So they invented a financial trick, a mechanism that was both ingenious and absolutely ruthless. Here's how the scam worked. Let's say the British Army needed 1 million uniforms. They would place an order with the government in India. The Indian government would then print local currency, rupees, and pay the local Indian tailors and weavers. The Indian people did the work, and they got paid in local cash. But the Indian government had effectively just loaned that money to Britain. Britain had to pay India back. But they didn't pay in gold, they didn't pay in goods, they didn't pay in equipment. Instead, the British Treasury simply opened a ledger in London. They made a bookkeeping entry. They credited India's account with pounds sterling. On paper, this looked fair. It looked like a normal trade. India was selling goods, and Britain was putting money into India's savings account in London. These savings became known as the sterling balances. By the end of the war, this account held £3 billion. In today's value, that is hundreds of billions of dollars. It was a fortune. It technically made India one of the richest creditors in the world, and Britain a massive debtor. But there was a catch that turned this transaction from a trade into a theft. The British government declared that these sterling balances were blocked. Imagine you work for a company for 5 years. They don't pay you a salary. Instead, they give you store credit that can only be used at the company store. But when you go to the store to buy food for your family, the door is locked. The owner tells you, you have a lot of store credit. You're rich. But you can't come in right now, maybe later. That is exactly what Britain did to India. India was not allowed to withdraw the money. They were forbidden from exchanging those pounds for US dollars to buy machinery from America. They weren't allowed to buy gold to stabilize their own economy. The money was trapped in London. It was a paper fortune that India could not touch, even while their people were starving. It was a frozen asset, a lie on paper. Think of it like this. Britain was taking real things from India. Real rice, real steel, real labor. But they were paying for it with an IOU that couldn't be cashed. The consequences were a nightmare. Because the British weren't paying real money, the Indian government had to print millions of extra rupees just to pay the local farmers and workers. The country was flooded with new cash, but here's the problem. The money stayed in India, but the stuff, the rice, the cloth, the wheat, was shipped out. It went to the British Army. So you have a country full of paper money but with nothing to buy. When you have too much cash chasing too few goods, you get one result. Prices go to the moon. The price of rice skyrocketed. The price of wheat tripled. The poor, who live day to day, found that their wages could no longer buy a single meal. And this leads us to a terrifying question. Was this just a mistake? Was it just bad management? You would hope so. You would hope that no government would intentionally starve millions of people just to balance a bank book, but that is exactly what happened. The man behind this system was John Maynard Keynes. In history books, he is a hero, the father of modern economics. But in this story, he is the architect of the theft. Keynes was advising the British Treasury. He knew exactly what he was doing. He admitted it in private. He called it a forced transfer of value. He knew that by printing money to buy goods, he was deliberately making the Indian people too poor to consume their own food, so that the British Army could eat it instead. The result was the Bengal Famine of 1943. We are told this famine was caused by nature, a cyclone, or maybe the war in Burma. Those are excuses. The primary driver was the financial system. The British government was printing money to buy up all the rice in Bengal. They exported it to the Middle East. The price rose so high that the Bengali peasant couldn't afford to eat the rice he grew. 3 million people died. They didn't die because there was no food. They died because the bank made the food too expensive to eat. While people were dying in the streets of Kolkata, the bank account in London kept growing. Every sack of rice taken from a starving village added a few more digits to the sterling balances. It is a grotesque image, a mountain of British wealth built on a mountain of Indian bodies. The British leaders knew. The Viceroy of India sent secret letters to London. He warned them. He said they were breaking the back of the Indian economy. But Winston Churchill? He ignored the warnings. His priority was beating Hitler. If India had to be squeezed dry to pay for it, he didn't care. He famously dismissed the famine. He said it was the Indians' fault for breeding like rabbits. He couldn't wrap his head around the idea that Britain, the master, owed money to India, the servant. By 1945, the war was over. Britain had won. But now, the bill was due. The United Kingdom owed its colonies over £3 billion. That is a staggering number. It was more money than the entire British economy produced in a year. The leaders of the colonies, places like India and Egypt, were expecting a check. India was about to become independent. Leaders like Gandhi looked at those billions in the bank as the seed money for their new nation. They planned to build factories, dams, schools. They believed that Britain, the noble defender of freedom, would honor its debt. They were wrong. The betrayal started immediately. Britain didn't just say they couldn't pay. They started a campaign to say they shouldn't pay. British politicians argued that the debt was unfair to Britain. They said, "We fought the war to protect the empire. You should be thanking us." They called the debt monstrous. Imagine the audacity. First they force India to give up its food. Then they cause a famine that kills 3 million people. And then, when the bill comes due, they ask for a discount. But asking for a discount is one thing. What Britain did next was straight-up extortion. They realized that since they held all the money in their own bank, they made the rules, and they were about to change the rules of the game to make sure India never saw a dime of real value. Winston Churchill was the most vocal supporter of this theft. He didn't want to negotiate. He wanted to simply rip up the check. He drafted secret memos suggesting that Britain should actually send India a bill. He wanted to charge India for the privilege of being defended by the British Empire. He wanted to tell the world that the debt was wiped clean. But in 1945, Churchill lost the election. The new Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, looked at the books and realized something terrifying. A total default was impossible. If Britain simply refused to pay its debts, the game was over. The City of London was the banking capital of the world. If a bank tells you, "We aren't giving you your money back because we don't feel like it," that bank closes the next day. No one would ever trust the British pound again. So, they needed a more subtle way to steal the money. They needed to find a way to default without actually calling it a default. They turned to the United States for help. At this time, Britain was begging America for a massive loan to rebuild its own shattered economy. The Americans were skeptical. They looked at the billions of pounds Britain owed to India and Egypt. The Americans worried that if they loaned money to Britain, the British would just hand it over to India to pay off their debts. The Americans didn't want to bail out India. They wanted to buy influence in Britain. So the US and UK made a quiet agreement. They would squeeze the colonies together. The Indian delegation fought back. They argued that this money wasn't just numbers on a screen. It represented the blood and sweat of the Indian people. It was compensation for the rice that was taken from starving villages. To refuse to pay it would be a theft of unprecedented scale, but Britain held all the cards. The British Treasury came up with a compromise. It was essentially a slow-motion default. They told India, "The money is yours, but you can't have it." The account was blocked. India could not withdraw the main sum. Britain would only release a tiny trickle of money each year, just enough to buy a few essential items, but never enough to actually build a modern nation. They treated the debt not as a legal obligation, but as an allowance given to a child. This brings us to a shocking reality that is rarely discussed. The money that could have transformed India was held hostage. Instead of building dams in Punjab, the capital stayed in London. The British government used that money to prop up their own currency. They used it to keep the British pound strong so that British consumers could buy cheap imports. They effectively used the savings of the Indian peasant to subsidize the standard of living of the British worker. Think about the great achievements of post-war Britain: the National Health Service, the rebuilding of British housing, the welfare state. We are taught that these were moral victories for the British people. But in financial terms, these noble projects were funded in part by refusing to pay back the war debt to the colonies. It was a massive transfer of wealth from the poorest people in the world to one of the richest nations on earth. But here is the thing. This was only the beginning of the trap. The real damage wasn't just blocking the money. The real damage was about to come from manipulating the value of the money itself. The war ended. The parades in London finished. But the financial war was just entering its most ruthless phase. The year is 1947. India is finally free. The Union Jack comes down over the Red Fort in Delhi. The new tricolor flag goes up. But while India had won its political freedom, its financial freedom was still locked in a vault 4,000 miles away. The new Indian Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, faced a terrifying reality. His country was broken. The partition of India and Pakistan had caused mass violence. The factories were old. The farms were empty. India desperately needed cash to buy machinery, to build power plants, and to modernize the nation. And technically they had the cash. They owned over £1 billion sitting in the Bank of England. It was their money. But when the Indian finance ministers went to London to ask for a check, they were met with cold smiles and closed doors. The British government set the trap. They signed a series of agreements that strictly limited India's access to its own money. The excuse was always the same. They said the British economy was too fragile. They argued, if we pay you back too quickly, the pound will collapse. And if the pound collapses, your savings are worthless anyway. It was a classic abusive relationship. I can't pay you back because I'm sick, and if you ask for your money, you'll kill me. So India waited. They waited for the right time to get their money. But while they waited, Britain was preparing to pull a lever that would wipe out the value of those savings overnight. Because there is one easy way to get out of debt without paying it. You simply make the money worth less. The victim was told to support the abuser for their own good. India had no choice. The entire global banking system was rigged in Britain's favor. India didn't have dollars. They didn't have gold. They only had these blocked pounds. So they were forced to accept the drip feed. They took the allowance. But the British Treasury had a darker plan. Delaying the payment wasn't enough. They wanted to shrink the debt until it didn't matter anymore. They couldn't cancel the debt legally. So they decided to destroy it economically. In 1949, the British government dropped a bomb. Not a literal one, but a financial one. They made a sudden, shocking announcement. They devalued the pound sterling against the US dollar by 30%. Here's what that means in simple terms. Overnight, the buying power of British money collapsed. For Britain, this was painful, but they did it to sell more exports. But for India, it was a catastrophe. Remember, India's national savings were held in pounds. When the pound lost 30% of its value, India effectively lost 30% of its national wealth in a single day. Imagine you save money for 10 years to buy a house. You finally have enough. You wake up the next morning, and the bank tells you, good news, your money is still there. But houses now cost 30% more. You didn't spend the money. You didn't lose the money. The money just evaporated. The machinery India wanted to buy from America? It was suddenly 30% more expensive. The technology they needed to build their nation was now out of reach. Economists call this an instant vaporization of wealth. Britain wiped out a huge chunk of what it owed to their colonies without ever paying a single penny. It was a default by another name, and they didn't just do it once. Throughout the 1950s, inflation ate away at the rest of the money. The interest rate Britain paid on these accounts was pitiful. It was almost zero, but inflation was high. This meant that every year the money sat in London, it became worth less and less. Think of it like putting a block of ice in an oven. Britain simply waited for the debt to melt. The contrast between the two nations during this time is heartbreaking. While India struggled to feed its population in the 1950s, Britain was enjoying a post-war boom. You often hear about the golden age of British capitalism. We hear about the birth of the National Health Service. We hear about the rebuilding of British cities. We hear about the generous social safety net. But where did the money come from? The National Health Service, the pride of Britain, was built on a foundation of financial stability, and that stability was subsidized by the forced loans from the empire. The cheap food and raw materials extracted during the war allowed Britain to keep its costs down. The blocked savings of the colonies ensured the British pound remained relevant. The average British family in the 1950s enjoyed a standard of living that was artificially supported by an invisible transfer of wealth from the East. This destroys the biggest myth of the British Empire. Apologists for the empire love to say that the colonies were a burden. They say, oh, Britain spent more on defending India than we ever got back. But the story of the sterling balances proves the opposite. In Britain's moment of greatest crisis, the empire wasn't a burden. It was a cash cow. It was a piggy bank to be smashed open and drained. The economist Utsa Patnaik has crunched the numbers. She looked at the total flow of wealth from India to Britain over the colonial period. When you add up the trade surpluses, the taxes, and the scams like the sterling balances, she came to a terrifying conclusion. She estimates that Britain extracted $45 trillion from India. $45 trillion. That number is so large that it is hard to comprehend. It is 17 times larger than the current GDP of the United Kingdom today. This explains the great mystery of the 20th century. It explains why India, one of the richest countries in the world in the 1700s, became one of the poorest. And it explains how a tiny island in the North Atlantic remained a global superpower. The legacy of this looting is still visible if you look at a map of India today. The lack of roads, the poverty that plagued the country for decades, the slow development, it can all be traced back to this theft of capital. Imagine if India had that £3 billion in 1947. Imagine if they could have bought the best technology from America and Germany. Imagine if they could have built high-speed rail and modern universities in the 1950s. The entire history of Asia would be different. India would have been a superpower 50 years ago. Instead, India was forced to beg. They had to go to the World Bank and the IMF. They had to accept humiliating loans with strict conditions, all while their own money sat locked in a vault in London, earning negative interest. But this story isn't just about money. It reveals the cynicism of the entire post-war world order, because the people who set up the rules were the same people who committed the robbery. The institutions built after the war, like the IMF and the World Bank, were supposed to be fair. We are told they were designed to fix the global economy, but in reality, they were designed to protect the bank manager, not the customer. When Britain finally agreed to release small amounts of the money, it attached strings. Thick, heavy strings. They pressured India to spend the released cash on British goods. Here is why that was a problem. By the 1950s, British machinery was old. It was outdated. It was more expensive than the new technology coming out of America or Germany. India wanted to buy American tractors and German steel mills, but they couldn't. They only had British pounds. So India was forced to buy second-rate equipment from the very country that had robbed them. This was the double theft. First, Britain took the money. Then, they forced India to use the leftovers to buy bad products. They effectively forced India to bail out British factories twice. It took decades to resolve this. The money was released so slowly and inflation ate it so fast that by the time India got the final payments, the value was gone. The seed capital for the new nation had turned to dust. The British government never apologized. They never admitted they defaulted. Instead, the history books tell a story of generosity. They say Britain graciously gave India its independence. They bury the fact that they looted the safe on the way out the door. Today, we view the world through the lens of foreign aid. We see wealthy countries giving charity to poor countries. We pat ourselves on the back. But the story of the sterling balances proves that the flow of money often goes the other way. The poor subsidized the rich. The starving Bengali peasant paid for the British soldier's dinner. The developing Indian economy paid for the reconstruction of London. It challenges everything we know about the 20th century. Yes, World War II was a fight against tyranny. It is a good thing the Allies won. But we have to be honest about who picked up the check. The bill wasn't paid by the British taxpayer alone. It was paid by subjects who were forced to lend their labor to a master who never planned to pay them back. The sterling trap was one of the most successful heists in history. It saved the British economy from total collapse. It allowed Britain to retreat from the empire without going bankrupt. But it teaches us a dark lesson about power. If you control the banking system, you don't need an army. If you control the currency, you can steal more wealth with a fountain pen than you can with 1,000 guns. The British Empire understood this. They knew that the ultimate power isn't owning the land, it's owning the debt. But this wasn't the first time a British entity used financial trickery to conquer a nation. In fact, a century earlier, a single corporation, not a government, but a company, managed to privatize all of India and invent the systems of control that made this heist possible. It is a story of how a group of merchants with a few ships managed to buy an entire subcontinent. You need to see how that happened right here. Click this video now.